When I say the word operating system, what comes to mind? You might think of Microsoft Windows, maybe Mac and the Mac OS, Apple computers. But what if I told you that there's an operating system you've probably never heard of that's completely free and is running everywhere? My name is Jesse, and today I'm going to talk to you about Linux. Linux is a free and open source operating system, and so we're going to dive into what Linux is and kind of how it's used. Linux is something that a lot of people aren't familiar with. It's not something that you see, if you're shopping for computers at the store, you don't see computers running Linux. But in the tech world, Linux is actually incredibly important. And it might even be something that you're already using and you don't know it, or maybe you would consider using it if you knew more about it. So this class is going to introduce you to Linux. So if you have any questions during this class, we'll be taking questions. This is live, so feel free to send those in the chat. You can also email us, trainer@massillonlibrary.org. So in today's class, we're going to be talking about what Linux is, and then we are going to look at why Linux is important or why it matters. And finally, we're going to look at how to use Linux. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. And we're going to start by talking about what Linux is. And so Linux is, as I said at the beginning, an operating system. And an operating system is something that a lot of people know the term, but they maybe don't know the definition of the term. Basically, an operating system is the kind of like the core software that runs on a computer that makes the hardware usable and then enables other programs to run. So examples of operating systems that you probably already use: if you use like a laptop, you're using Microsoft Windows more likely than not. There's Mac OS for Apple computers. And then on phones, we have Android and iOS for iPhone. So there's all kinds of different operating systems that we use every day. Linux is an alternative to Windows and Mac typically for computers. So for computer operating systems, it's an alternative to Windows and Mac. And the thing that makes Linux distinct from Windows and Mac is that it is free and open source. So let's unpack that a little bit. So what does that mean? It's free and it's open source. Well, it's free as in freedom. So you have the freedom to do what you want with software like Linux. It's not proprietary. It's not kind of locked down by copyright. It's also free as in cost in a lot of situations. In fact, in most situations, Linux is completely free in price. The open source piece is another part of that equation. So what does open source mean? Open source means that the source code for the operating system is available for anybody to see. So if you are a developer or a programmer, you can go online and find the actual code and look through it for yourself. That is a big departure from maybe more traditional types of software that is closed source. So it's proprietary. You can't see it. And there's pros and cons to both of those types of software. Open source software is nice because you have a lot of different eyes seeing it. So it's harder to kind of sneak stuff in. Typically you have very good security in open source projects just because you can have so many people looking at it. The downside is that it is a little more chaotic if you have, all kinds of people sort of being able to contribute and then possibly create their own projects and stuff. So the open source world is sometimes seems like the Wild West, so to speak, compared to proprietary stuff. So that's a little bit about that free and open source nature of Linux. It is a free and open source operating system for computers. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Linux, and then we're going to get a little into more of like how it works, and then we're going to show you a bit of Linux actually running on a computer. Linux has been around since 1991. So it was released by a guy named Linus Torvalds. He's a Finnish software engineer, and so he kind of started it as a personal project. There was some different operating systems that were being used at that time, and he kind of created Linux as a kind of just a hobby, just something to do. And then Linux kind of went from being a personal project to being used all over the place. So Linux is an international kind of phenomenon, I guess, as far as being used in things like web servers and in the tech world. So Linux is kind of a big deal. As far as defining Linux a little better, so there's all kinds of stuff that goes into Linux, and technically Linux, when we use that term, it's just like the kernel of the operating system. So the operating system is like this core piece of software, right, that makes your computer run. Well, within the operating system, there's this thing called the kernel, and the kernel is actually what Linux is, and then other pieces are kind of bolted on top of that kernel. So you have things like the desktop environment, kind of what you look at when you run the computer. You have the programs that run on the operating system. It's all these kind of different pieces that kind of get put together, and when that happens, that's called a distribution of Linux. So when you use Linux, you are using that Linux kernel plus other pieces of software, and so companies or organizations will kind of put that all together and then package it together for you, and you can install it on your computer. Because Linux is open source, there's not just one version of Linux, right? So there's not, it's not like if you go online and you type in Linux, there's just one and you download it and that's that. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of different forms or different distributions of Linux that exist. And that's owing to the kind of the free nature of Linux. Some of the most popular ones of those distributions are Ubuntu. So it's kind of like a funny name, I guess, but we're actually going to be looking at Ubuntu here in a little bit as far as seeing Linux in action. We have Fedora is another very popular form of Linux, and that's made by a company called Red Hat. And then there's all kinds of different other ones. We could spend all day talking about them, but just know that when we talk about Linux, it's not just one kind of monolithic thing. It's many variations of a similar thing and many different approaches to how to package together an operating system. So if you were going to be running Linux on a computer, there's the question of like, how would you actually go about doing that? And so to run Linux on a computer, you would actually end up creating a USB drive, and then within that USB drive, you would take the file you downloaded. It would be an ISO file, and you would burn it to that drive, and then you could install it on your computer. And we are going to not look at that entire process, but we will kind of see the end result of that here toward later on in the class. But as far as what Linux is, that is kind of just a brief overview of Linux. So I'm joined tonight by Jeff. So Jeff, many of you will recognize him from previous classes. He's helped us out, quite a bit. He actually works here at the library, so I'm gonna kind of be checking in with Jeff through the night. But I kind of wanted to just get his thoughts on if there was anything he would add to that definition of Linux. So is that a fair definition, Jeff?
Yeah, I'd say that's all good. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. So Jeff and I, just as a disclaimer, Jeff and I both use Linux to varying degrees at home and sometimes at work. So we have experience as users of Linux. So that is kind of it for what Linux is. What I'd like to do now is I would like to talk about why Linux is important. And so Linux is important because of a number of reasons. Number one, it's important because of where it is used. Linux is used in a lot of different scenarios. It's used on web servers. So anytime you go to a website, So let's say you go to google.com or you go to amazon.com, facebook.com. Anytime you go to a website, you are actually probably interacting with Linux. The server or the computer that sends you the web pages almost invariably is going to be running Linux. Linux is very dominant in that area. It is also very prevalent in things like supercomputers. So these computers that are like incredibly powerful. I was just looking, the top 500 supercomputers in the entire world are all running Linux, which is kind of a testament to how popular Linux is within the tech community. So it's popular in supercomputers. It's also very popular in things like they're called embedded systems. So these are computers that we don't really see, but that we interact with on a daily basis. So I'm talking things like cars. So a lot of cars have computers all through them. Many manufacturers of cars use Linux to power those computers. Things like appliances. So any kind of like appliance that has any kind of computerized technology within it is going to be using Linux. And there's just a lot of different applications of Linux within that sort of like embedded system scenario. So Linux is used there. Linux is also used in other situations that we don't necessarily realize. So one of those would be within the Android smartphone. So many of you are either going to be probably using an iPhone or an Android phone. Android is based on Linux at its core. It is actually running the Linux kernel, as far as I understand, and then they kind of, add things to it for the smartphone. So the Android operating system is based on Linux. Chrome OS, so Chromebooks, we see those in stores all over the place. You'll see Chromebooks. Those are actually based on Linux as well. And then finally, among other things, Linux is actually used on personal computers. So if you wanted to, you could run Linux on your own computer, on a laptop, on a desktop, any kind of situation like that. Now, as far as the number of people that do that, Linux is very popular in servers. Linux is very popular within these other situations. It's not as popular on personal computers. In fact, it is depending on what you kind of look at as far as statistics, Linux accounts for maybe up to 2% of personal computers through the world. Windows, on the other hand, accounts for upwards of 80%. So Windows is very dominant in the personal computer market. Linux isn't quite at that point, not nearly. But Linux can be run on personal computers. Now, the question we could ask is also who uses Linux, right? So what are people or what kind of organizations tend to use Linux? And within the realm of personal computers, a lot of people that use Linux are going to be software developers, software engineers. They could be kind of tech enthusiasts, that sort of thing. It's very popular within that realm. You also have a lot of people that maybe are into science or statistics or other things that use Linux. And then you also just have a lot of normal people that end up using Linux. There's stories of governments throughout the world, some in Europe, some in North America, that have switched to using Linux. So you have organizations that use it, and then also just regular people can use Linux on their own computers. So we've talked about
Jesse. Before I'm sorry,
yeah.
I was just going to cut in real quick.
Yeah, sure.
When you were talking about government, so one thing most people know who NASA is. NASA actually runs on Red Hat, so they have like all of that is set up through Red Hat, which I think is kind of interesting. So all of our space missions are done through Linux.
That's a very interesting point. And so that does, I think, speak to the capability of Linux. So it's not like some rinky-dink, kind of thing. It's something that NASA is using to send rockets into space. So it's got to be pretty good, right? If it can do that. Yeah. So as far as who uses Linux, we can add NASA to that list. Um, as far as maybe some of the reasons why you would want to use Linux, I want to go through some of the kind of the pros and the cons of it, and we're talking, to be clear, in terms of personal computers, right? We're not talking, about servers or anything like that. So if you have a personal computer, why might you want to use Linux? One of the big reasons that people gravitate towards Linux is because of that freedom that we talked about. So Linux is completely free as in freedom, so you're not beholden to a particular company or to a particular vendor with Linux. You can use whatever you want. You can switch around between different distributions even. So freedom's a big deal. Security is also a big pro or advantage for Linux. Linux tends to be more secure, and just because of how it's designed, and also because it's not used quite as much, so it's not targeted by hackers and people that develop malware. Linux does tend to be a little more secure, and so that's one of the advantages of it. Privacy is another reason people might use Linux on platforms like Microsoft Windows or other things like this. Companies do a lot of data collection on those. They call it telemetry or usage, data or different things. That doesn't happen as much, if at all, on a Linux machine, just because it's kind of not in the DNA of Linux to do that. So we have the privacy, and then also the cost. So we talked about freedom earlier, as in the freedom, but also it's free. I mean, you can use Linux and you don't have to pay a dime for it. Whereas with Windows, you have to buy a license to use it. Or with Mac OS, you have to buy hardware that's running that operating system. All right. Those are some of the advantages of Linux. Let's talk about some of the maybe the disadvantages, or maybe reasons why you wouldn't want to use Linux on a personal computer. And one of the big things with Linux is its more technical nature. So what do I mean by that? So technical nature. This would be referring to the fact that Linux does sometimes require a little more knowledge in order to get it up and running. So if you are not really that familiar with computers, you may find Linux to be a little overwhelming at times. Now, I will say that it has kind of become very user-friendly, especially in certain distributions. And we're going to be looking at one of those that is very user-friendly. But you still are going to see generally a higher required knowledge, that you need to run Linux as opposed to maybe something like Mac or Windows. So there's that kind of technical nature of Linux that maybe dissuades people from running it. There's also things like software compatibility. So if you want to run certain pieces of software, so maybe Microsoft Office, you really want to run Microsoft Office. You can't do that on Linux because Microsoft has not developed Microsoft Office for Linux. Now, that could change in the future. There have been situations where Microsoft has made their software available on Linux. In fact, recently, within the last couple of years, they've been increasingly doing that. But right now, you don't have that compatibility. Jeff and I were just talking earlier about the Adobe program. So Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, those aren't available right now on Linux. So, if you really need those particular programs, Linux might not be for you. So there's the software compatibility. There is maybe another thing which would get to the hardware. So with Linux, because it's open source and because it is sort of a team of people that are working on it, and it's these different companies also that get involved. A lot of times they're kind of playing catch up. So if you have the latest and greatest hardware and you try to run Linux on it, you will occasionally get maybe things where, I can't use my hardware the way I would want to. Maybe my webcam doesn't work. Maybe what was it, Jeff? We were just talking about a few weeks ago, the Wi-Fi cards, right? Like there's situations where newer Wi-Fi cards are not supported. So if you were running Linux on a brand new laptop, it might not work entirely. Now, if you give it 6 months or so, usually they kind of get all that stuff taken care of, and then you can run Linux without any issue. So those are some of the downsides to running Linux. Overall, if we were to ask, is Linux for you, as if you consider yourself sort of an average computer user, is it for you? I mean, in most cases, maybe no, but I also have seen where just regular computer users have used Linux and it works out fine. So it doesn't necessarily require this super high level of technical prowess, I guess you could say. But, I could understand if somebody, said, that's not for me. I'd rather just stick with what I'm familiar with or what I know I can get help with, through technical support. So anyway, that is just a little kind of discussion of why Linux is important and kind of a little tangent about whether it would be something that you would be interested in. We talked a little bit before about how you would actually get Linux. And so there is, when we talk about the technical nature of Linux, there is a little bit that's involved in getting Linux to run on your computer. And we can't really go too deep into that in this class because it's sort of beyond our scope. But it's not that hard, but you do have to use a flash drive, download a file, put the file onto the flash drive, and then boot up your computer and reinstall the operating system. All right. So that is going to be why Linux matters. Gonna take a drink here, and then we're going to get to our last section of the class.
While you're taking a break here, Jesse, I was going to say, there's also, Jesse was talking about downloading it onto a jump drive to boot your computer and install it. A lot of the distributions now also allow you to run Linux off of that jump drive before you install it, to kind of try before you buy. So, and that's not going to affect, maybe your Windows operating system that you already have on that laptop. So there are some advantages to maybe getting that on a jump drive and testing out the system first before you do the install.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point, Jeff. Yeah, so you don't even really have to commit to installing it. You just download it, try it out. If you don't like it, no problem. So yeah, awesome. So we're gonna go ahead and move on. And so we've talked about what Linux is. We've talked about why Linux matters. What I'd like to do now is talk about how to use Linux. And so for this piece of the class, I'm actually going to be showing you a running distribution of Linux, or a running installation of Linux, and that will be something called Ubuntu. It's kind of a strange word. A lot of people call it Ubuntu. But it's Ubuntu. If you're interested, you can look it up. Ubuntu has kind of been, for a number of years, sort of seen as maybe the most popular Linux distribution, or maybe the one that is maybe suitable for beginners. If you're just dipping your toes in the water, you want to see kind of the user-friendly side of Linux. Ubuntu is kind of that distribution. So we're going to be showing you Ubuntu 20.04. So it's kind of like the most recent long-term support version of Ubuntu. So within the Ubuntu release kind of cycle, there are some releases that are more aggressive and have more newer features, and then every 2 years they release one and they say, this one we're going to stand behind for a while and it's going to be more solid, more stable. And in my experience, those releases have been very, very reliable. You typically don't have problems as much with those. So we're on Ubuntu 20.04. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to it now, and we'll actually take a look at Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is running on something called the GNOME desktop environment. So remember how we talked at the beginning how Linux is kind of this collection of things. So there's the core kernel of Linux, and then there's all these other pieces. Well, GNOME is one of those pieces, and Ubuntu is actually running a modified version of GNOME. I know Jeff, he uses a distribution called Fedora, and so Fedora actually kind of ships the just GNOME without any modification. So it looks slightly different than this, but it's largely a similar, experience, I guess. So this is GNOME, and so you can see here on the left, you've got kind of like a launcher. This is one of Ubuntu's kind of additions to make it a little, I guess, more friendly or easier to use. So there's a launcher over on the left, and you've got just programs. We could launch any of these. If we go down here to this button, this will show you all of the programs that are actually on the computer. And right now we've got just the standard programs. We have things like Mozilla Firefox, which is a web browser. We've got the LibreOffice suite, so that's kind of like an open source version of Microsoft Office. And then we've got some other things. We have calculators, calendars, whatnot. So we're going to go ahead and hit that button again to go out of that. So that's sort of, how we would launch programs. We have a menu here at the top right, and we could go into things like the settings and then change settings if we would like. So this is kind of similar to like the control panel if you're coming from Windows, or the settings menu. We can browse our files just like we can on Windows. So this is the Files app, and we can go into our documents, and we don't really have anything right now, but you could organize your files. We could also get more programs if we wanted to. As far as program support in Linux, so there are a number of programs that you may have heard of that are available on Linux. So things like Firefox that we talked about. You can get Google Chrome running on Linux. Google releases Chrome directly for Linux. A browser I've begun to use is called Brave, and Brave has a version for Linux. So things like that. We also have LibreOffice that I mentioned. There is a program called GIMP, which is kind of like Adobe Photoshop. And then we have Audacity, that's like an audio editor. So these are kind of popular-ish programs that you can run through Linux, and they work just as well as they do on Windows or on Mac. So let's go ahead and just kind of take another look here at some of the programs that we have. And if we scroll through, you can see we have the ability to do updates. We have some games that have been included with Ubuntu here, and then we have some photo programs as well. So as far as like how this kind of works in principle, it looks a little different, I suppose, than Windows, but really it's the same thing. Once you get over the different look of it, you can launch programs, you can minimize them, you can do all the same things that you would do on Windows or Mac. It's just a different operating system, a different look and feel to it. Other desktop environments are a little bit more similar to Windows as far as how they look. There is a desktop environment called KDE that looks very similar to Windows, and so I've used KDE a little bit here and there, and I do enjoy it, but GNOME is also kind of cool as well. I kind of prefer GNOME on a laptop. You can kind of manage things a little better. It's very keyboard focused, I guess you could say. So that's just a little introduction there to Ubuntu. So you can see it's nothing too groundbreaking. Now, as far as how Linux kind of runs, we haven't really got into that, but one of the big advantages of Linux over something like Windows is its speed. Linux is very efficient when it comes to using hardware resources. So if you had the same computer and one was running Windows, one was running Linux, the Linux version of the computer probably will go quicker and it will be able to do things faster just because of kind of how Linux is. Linux is a little more lightweight on hardware, and there are different distributions that really cater to that. So I've used, Linux on computers that are 10 years old and they run like a charm. And that's something that you're not going to be able to do on Windows. You get an older computer with Windows and it's like, I got to think about getting a new one. So as far as how it runs, that is one piece to keep in mind. If you have an older computer and you want to extend its life, one thing that I've recommended to people before is, try out Linux. You've got nothing to lose. And if you don't like it, then you're just going to get a new computer like you would anyway. But if you do like it, you could save yourself a lot of money and actually extend the life of that computer by many years potentially. And you'll be running the latest updates, the latest security updates and all of that. So that's just a little kind of introduction to seeing Linux in action. Like I said, we are not going to be getting too much into like the actual installation of Linux itself today, but that just gives you a sense of kind of how it looks. And here it is again. As far as I'll show you LibreOffice here. So if you wanted to type documents, we have LibreOffice Writer. If you wanted to do, it's running slow because it's actually running in something called a virtual machine on a computer, those are a little slower. This is a spreadsheet program, right? So you can do all of those kind of similar tasks in Linux just like you would in Windows. Did I miss anything there, Jeff? I mean, is there anything you would add as far as like the actual day-to-day operation of Linux?
No, I mean, it's very similar. I think, like I've told you before, I've kind of moved back and forth with Linux over the years, and just within the last couple years, it seems like Linux has gotten a lot easier to use. Where it's an option. I have my PC dual booted at home, and I tend to be in Linux now more than I ever have, a little more so than Windows. So. Yeah. It takes a little getting used to. There's some things that are different. You can definitely get in the weeds with it. It can be kind of a heavy thing to learn, but it also has options that are simple as well. So yeah. I'm also putting in the chat, if you guys look, some links to Ubuntu and Fedora and some stuff. So you guys can check that out. Yeah. After the live stream.
Yeah, absolutely. And each of those will have instructions on like how to install it. Mm-hmm. So if you want to check it out or even just do that live USB like Jeff was talking about earlier, you can do that. Mm-hmm. The one thing you were talking about kind of how you went back and forth with it. And I can say from my experience, like I've been using Linux pretty much exclusively at home for a number of years. There was a time where I was kind of using them both, and then I just eventually kind of switched over to Linux completely. And so I've had a very good experience with it. I'm kind of you might count me as maybe a Linux enthusiast, but I'm to the point where I couldn't really foresee myself running Windows at home unless I had to for whatever reason. I keep a copy around in case I need it, but Linux is kind of feels right now, so you definitely can transition to it full time if you so choose. So we've talked about what Linux is. We talked about kind of why Linux matters. And then finally, we looked a little bit there about how to use Linux. So my intent with this class was to just kind of give you like an introduction to Linux. I'm certainly not trying to convince anybody to use Linux. Linux is not for everybody. If you like things, to be just the way you've always had them on Windows and you don't want to change, I entirely understand that. Or if you don't want to mess with, trying something new out, completely get that. I'm not trying to talk you into it, but it's good to know what Linux is because you will probably eventually hear people talking about it, and you might just before have been like, well, I don't know what that is. But now you have at least a baseline knowledge of what Linux is and kind of why it is used and why some people do like it quite a bit. You might never end up using it. You may never try it out, but you will likely use it in some degree. So what do I mean by that? You may not use it on your personal computer, but you will be using Linux on things like your car, your phone. NASA's using Linux, as Jeff mentioned. So there's all of these kind of situations out there where we're using Linux and we don't realize it. So it's kind of cool to know a little bit more about what that is, how it works, and sort of kind of putting all that together. So that's about it for tonight's class. I would like to thank you all for joining us. And if you have any further questions, you can get in touch with us. So we'll have our contact information up when we end here. We can be reached by phone or by email. But thank you guys, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next online class. Any last words, Jeff, before we go?
No, I just so I gave everybody options. I gave Ubuntu, Fedora, and Pop OS. Those are probably three
Nice.
of the most popular ones right now. So yeah, definitely check those out if you guys have some time.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys, and we will see you next time.